Chapter 1. Birth and Early Life. In the ancient town of Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, a boy was born who would become one of the most significant figures in the history of Israel. His name was David, the youngest son of Jesse, a humble shepherd. Growing up in the pastoral beauty of Bethlehem, David learned the skills of a shepherd, spending his days tending his father's flocks. These early years in the fields, with the sheep as his companions, were formative. It was here that David developed his bravery, his musical talents, and his deep faith in God. David's family was of modest means, and his brothers were more prominent in the eyes of society. They were strong, capable men, suited for the rigors of battle and the tasks of the household. Yet, despite his youth and his lower standing in the family hierarchy, David's heart was pure and his spirit was fierce. He had a natural affinity for music, often playing the harp to pass the time and soothe the sheep. His voice, strong and melodic, filled the fields with songs of praise and worship to God, who he believed watched over him and his flock. Chapter 2. Anointing as future king. David's life took a dramatic turn when the prophet Samuel, under God's direction, visited Bethlehem to anoint a new king. King Saul, the current ruler of Israel, had fallen out of favor with God due to his disobedience. God instructed Samuel to go to the house of Jesse, for among his sons was the future king of Israel. Jesse presented his sons to Samuel, starting with the eldest. Each of them was tall, strong, and impressive in their own right. However, God told Samuel that none of these men were the chosen one. Confused, Samuel asked Jesse if he had any other sons. Reluctantly, Jesse mentioned his youngest, David, who was out in the fields tending the sheep. When David was brought before Samuel, God confirmed that this young shepherd was indeed the one. Samuel anointed David with oil, signifying God's choice of him as the future king of Israel. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David, preparing him for the great journey ahead. Chapter 3. Service to King Saul. David's path to kingship began with a call to serve in King Saul's court. Saul, tormented by an evil spirit, needed someone to soothe his troubled mind. David's reputation as a skilled harpist and singer reached the palace, and he was summoned to play for the king. Whenever Saul was tormented, David's music brought him peace, and the evil spirit would depart from him. David's presence in the royal court provided him with invaluable experience. He observed the workings of the kingdom, learned the ways of the court, and developed relationships with influential figures. Saul grew fond of David, making him his armor-bearer. Yet, despite this favor, David remained humble, always mindful of his anointing and God's plan for his life. Chapter 4. Defeat of Goliath. David's bravery and faith were tested in one of the most iconic moments of his life, the battle with Goliath. The Philistines, Israel's formidable enemies, challenged the Israelites with their champion, Goliath, a giant of a man who struck fear into the hearts of Saul's soldiers. For 40 days, Goliath taunted the Israelites, demanding a one-on-one combat to settle the conflict. David, sent by his father to bring provisions to his brothers on the battlefield, heard Goliath's defiance. Filled with righteous indignation, he volunteered to face the giant. Despite Saul's reservations and the mockery of his brothers, David's faith in God gave him courage. He refused the king's armor, choosing instead his shepherd's staff, 5 smooth stones, and his sling. In the face of overwhelming odds, David confronted Goliath, declaring his faith in the Lord of hosts. With a single stone from his sling, David struck Goliath on the forehead, felling the giant. Using Goliath's own sword, David beheaded him, securing a stunning victory for Israel. This triumph marked the beginning of David's rise to prominence and solidified his reputation as a fearless warrior and a man of faith. Chapter 5. Friendship with Jonathan. David's victory over Goliath brought him closer to King Saul's family, particularly Saul's son, Jonathan. Despite the potential rivalry for the throne, Jonathan and David formed an extraordinary friendship. Jonathan, recognizing David's anointing and God's favor upon him, loved David as his own soul. Their bond was one of mutual respect, loyalty, and selflessness. Jonathan gave David his royal robe, armor, sword, bow, and belt, symbolizing his support and recognition of David's future kingship. Their covenant of friendship was a profound and enduring one, with Jonathan pledging to support David despite the looming threat from his father, Saul. Chapter 6. Military Leadership. David's growing fame and prowess in battle earned him a position as a leader in Saul's army. He led his men to numerous victories, his strategic brilliance and fearless leadership inspiring those under his command. The people of Israel sang his praises, saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." David's success on the battlefield, however, fueled Saul's jealousy and paranoia. Saul became increasingly wary of David, seeing him as a threat to his throne. Despite this, David continued to serve Saul faithfully, always aware that his ultimate loyalty was to God. Chapter 7. Fleeing from Saul. Saul's growing envy and fear drove him to seek David's life. Warned by Jonathan, David fled from the court, becoming a fugitive. He wandered through the wilderness, evading Saul's relentless pursuit. During this period, David gathered a loyal group of followers, many of whom were outcasts and discontented men who found in David a capable and compassionate leader. Despite the constant danger, David's faith never wavered. He continued to trust in God's promise, believing that he would one day ascend to the throne. His time in the wilderness was marked by moments of divine intervention and protection, reinforcing his belief in God's plan for his life. Chapter 8. Sparing Saul's life. David had multiple opportunities to kill Saul and seize the throne, but he chose to spare Saul's life, respecting him as the Lord's anointed king. On one occasion, David and his men hid in a cave where Saul unknowingly entered to rest. David's men urged him to kill Saul, but David cut off a corner of Saul's robe instead, proving his loyalty and restraint. David confronted Saul from a distance, showing the piece of robe and declaring his innocence and respect. Saul, moved by David's mercy, wept and acknowledged David's righteousness. Despite this moment of reconciliation, Saul's jealousy soon resurfaced, and he continued to pursue David. Chapter 9. Alliance with the Philistines. As Saul's pursuit intensified, David sought refuge among the Philistines, Israel's enemies. He entered into the service of Achish, the king of Gath, and was given the town of Ziklag to reside in with his men. David conducted raids against Israel's enemies while maintaining the pretense of loyalty to Achish. David's time with the Philistines was a strategic move that provided temporary safety from Saul's relentless pursuit. It also allowed David to build his strength and prepare for the future without directly confronting Saul. Chapter 10. Becoming king of Judah. Following Saul's death in battle against the Philistines, David returned to Hebron in Judah. The men of Judah anointed him as their king, beginning his reign over the southern tribe. For 7.5 years, David ruled Judah, consolidating his power and preparing for the unification of all Israel. David's reign in Hebron was marked by political maneuvering and continued conflict with the house of Saul. Despite the challenges, David's leadership and his reliance on God guided him through these tumultuous years. Chapter 11. Unification of Israel. The death of Saul's son, Ishbosheth, paved the way for David to become king of all Israel. The elders of Israel came to Hebron and anointed David as their king, uniting the northern and southern tribes under his rule. David's reign over a united Israel marked the beginning of a new era of prosperity and strength for the nation. David established his capital in Jerusalem, a strategically located city that became the political and spiritual center of Israel. His leadership brought stability and growth, and his military campaigns expanded Israel's territory and influence. Chapter 12. Conquest of Jerusalem. One of David's most significant achievements was the capture of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. The city, with its natural fortifications, was a formidable stronghold. David led his men through a daring assault, using a water shaft to infiltrate the city's defenses and secure a decisive victory. Jerusalem, also known as the City of David, became the heart of David's kingdom. He built his palace there and initiated plans to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city, further solidifying its importance as the center of worship and governance. Chapter 13. Bringing the Ark to Jerusalem. David's desire to honor God and establish Jerusalem as the religious center of Israel led him to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city. The Ark, symbolizing God's presence and covenant with Israel, had been housed in various locations since the days of Moses. David organized a grand procession to transport the ark to Jerusalem. The journey was not without its challenges. An initial attempt ended in tragedy when Uzzah, one of the men handling the ark, was struck dead for touching it. David, fearful and reverent, paused the endeavor but later resumed with greater care and celebration. The successful arrival of the ark in Jerusalem was marked by joyous worship, music, and sacrifices. David himself danced with all his might before the Lord, an act of profound devotion and humility. Chapter 14. Covenant with God. In Jerusalem, David expressed his desire to build a permanent temple for the Arkansas. However, through the prophet Nathan, God revealed that David would not build the temple. Instead, his son Solomon would undertake this task. God made a covenant with David, promising that his dynasty would endure forever. This divine promise, known as the Davidic covenant, was a pivotal moment in David's life. It assured him that his lineage would continue to rule Israel and that through his descendants, God's eternal kingdom would be established. Chapter 15. Succession and Death. As David aged, he faced the challenges of succession and family strife. His sons, Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah, each caused turmoil, testing David's leadership and resolve. Despite these personal trials, David remained committed to God's will and the future of his kingdom. In his final years, David ensured the succession of his son Solomon, following God's guidance. He gave Solomon his blessing and charged him with the task of building the temple and leading Israel with wisdom and justice. David died after a reign of 40 years, having established a legacy of faith, courage, and devotion to God. He was buried in Jerusalem, the city he had captured and transformed into the heart of Israel. David's life, marked by triumphs and trials, remains a testament to God's faithfulness and the enduring power of faith and humility.